Our guest speaker for today, her name is Brittany Piersma. Brittany has a Bachelor of Science degree in Environmental Science and worked for 4 years as a zookeeper at the Naples Zoo. She also has volunteered for the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, Rookery Bay, the Florida Panther Refuge, and Audubon. And she was a critical wildlife area shorebird biologist for FWC and a shorebird steward for the Audubon Western Everglades. So currently she's a field biologist at the Audubon Western Everglades, and she's involved in surveying winter birds, and she works with their burrowing owl program and gopher tortoises as well. So very varied experience. So take it away, Brittany.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Very excited today to be able to talk about shorebird and seabird migration. We also do a lot of stewardship on our beach to help educate about all these migratory flocks that do come to our area. Now, it's great that we kind of have the benefit of, we do have a small amount of shorebirds that do nest in our beach in the summer, but we're a great location that we get to see birds that migrate from their nesting grounds further north and either come to our area temporarily or stay throughout the winter. So we have the both benefits of getting nesting and wintering species that we get to see year round. So the first question that most people ask is, why do birds migrate? And a lot of people think that birds migrate typically just because it gets cold where they are up north, and then they're going to want to come down south to where it's warm. Now, there's a variety of different reasons why they migrate, and different individuals of each species may have their own reason as well. So number one, with the most driven impact for them would be driven for their food and resources. So in some areas that may be reliant on the weather. So if it does get colder in a location that they're depleted of all the food that's available to them, then yes, they do need to migrate further south to find those food sources. But in some areas, the temperature doesn't mean that they have to migrate. So birds are able to survive in these locations. It just requires of whether or not they have that food available. So that's kind of the biggest impact of where they're going to migrate to. So some birds also are migrating more because they have short-term reasons for it. So if they only have to go a short distance from maybe a couple states down from where they are in North America, as long as they can find that food source, then they may stay in that location. Whereas there's other species that are long distance migrants. Now, these migrants have evolved over the years in many different ways, have their exact routes of where they're going, what they're doing to have the most success. So if you think of birds that are nesting all the way up in the Arctic, and then they're migrating all the way down south, it's because they know that there's this extreme abundance of food and perfect conditions up north, all the way in the Arctic area during the summertime, but then that goes to total darkness and it kind of depletes their food sources up there. So then they have found that all the way down south, there's the same equivalent of abundant food sources. So they know the route and they've adapted over time and evolved over years, and different generations have learned where are the best places to go to get what they need. So look at this slide, we'll look at some of the longest migrants. We have seen all of these birds in our area. One is unique that I'll talk about in a minute, it's not common, but all of these birds have either been in the Gulf nearby or coming on our shoreline as well. So the first one would be the Arctic tern. Currently, the Arctic tern holds the status of the longest migrant in the world. So the current record is 6,000 miles in 1 year. Now that's a very small bird. It may look like he's got a pretty big wingspan, but that bird is probably about the size of your hand, a very small tern. So typically they're migrating from the Arctic to Antarctica, and they travel about 25,000 miles a year. We can see these birds flying offshore, so you may see flocks of them going through the Gulf if you're on a boat. Sometimes you can spot them from sandbars as well, but typically Arctic terns are never going to be landing on the shore unless they are completely exhausted. So it's not going to be a common bird that you'll see landing on our beaches. Now, red knots are probably something that more people are familiar with when you're hearing about migrants. I highly recommend looking at the book Rufa Red Knot and reading more about them. But red knots are a common migrant to many citizens, especially living up in Maine. You may have heard of the red knot migration when they're coming for the abundant amount of eggs that arrive in that area. That's a peak time for them to be able to come through. So over time, they've evolved their migration They know when they need to stop over at Maine, refuel on those horseshoe crab eggs, and then they can continue to their journey. So typically they are migrating from the Arctic all the way down to the south tip of South America. And so every year that's about 18,000 miles, which is pretty incredible. That's a very small shorebird. And most people, when they see them on the beach, they think they look just of that as a sanderling. And I'll jump to the sanderling real quick because a sanderling is a common bird that most people do see along our shoreline. They're the ones that you see running up and down as the waves are coming. So a lot of people think this is a year-round bird and then they must nest in our area, but they do not. So sanderlings as well travel thousands of miles from the Arctic down to South America. And they're a very tiny bird. So it's pretty cool to think of a bird you're seeing every single day is traveling this great of a distance. The bar-tailed godwit I have on here is another way to show that birds can get a little out of their route at times and end up in places that they might not want to be in. So this bar-tailed godwit would typically travel from Alaska to New Zealand. So he wouldn't cross paths with most of North America, especially wouldn't end up in Florida. But this bird actually ended up in Marco Island last winter. And a birder spotted it because it looked a little bit different than a willet, what we're used to seeing on the shoreline with that long beak, but that little pink reddish color on the beak stood out. And we all went out there and we were able to confirm an ID on it. So this bird could have gotten taken away through a storm, or maybe it just got off course for whatever reason. And it ended up in our area. It stayed here for about a month and then it disappeared. We're hoping it found its route back to its typical migration. But that's another really cool time of the time of year that these birds are coming. You know what you might see. These are the common birds that we always know are going to migrate to our area, but you might have a pretty cool species that shows up on your beach. So the next question a lot of people ask is, do all birds migrate? And the answer would be no. And so this depends on a variety of different reasons. So as I mentioned, the sanderlings, people see sanderlings on our beaches year round. We do have year-round resident birds on our beaches. This could be for a variety of different reasons. Number one, they're not of breeding age yet. Why waste your energy migrating all the way back up north if you're not able to breed? Other birds, maybe they aren't suitable to breed. But in different instances, some birds won't migrate because they have seen that it's suitable to stay in the area to defend their territory. So if they stay in a location that they have enough food sources, when the other birds migrate back, they've already marked off exactly where they want to nest. They've kept it safe that whole time. So some birds see that as a benefit. They're putting two different things together. We want to have success during the nesting season, but we also want to have success when we're migrating and stay healthy during that time of the year as well. Additionally, changes in temperature and food sources will also impact these birds. So say it is warmer up where they are and they don't need to leave for food sources. That would keep them in some areas. We do have birds that have shown up on our beaches this winter that we usually don't see stay in our area. They typically feed for a little bit and then leave. They've stayed almost our whole winter in this one location up in North Naples. And we think it's because there's just abundant amount of food sources. The mudflats have been perfect. They have a variety of different carbohydrates and lipids that they're feeding on. So they have everything they need to just stay right where they're at. And why waste the energy if you don't have to? Another reason people might think of, especially with songbirds and things that we might put out, bird feeders and things, human interaction can also impact whether or not birds migrate. If they're getting what they need, it's all right. But in some cases, it may affect whether or not they're able to survive. So this is just a list that you'll see. I don't expect you to look at it all, but I highly recommend when you go out in the field to look at common birds in your area, especially the migrants in our area. But I highly recommend going to our website, and I'll link it at the end. I have actually gone through and made a really cool guide from egg to adult breeding plumage of all the birds that we see migrate through our area and the birds that nest in our area. So I definitely recommend when you're going out on the beach to bring something with you, because it's always a great time, especially as soon as it hits the end of September, all the way to now. We're about right now in the last 2 months of winter migration for these birds. So most birds have been established where they're at, and now they're going to start migrating back to where they're going to nest. But it's definitely a good time to bring out your books, get those binoculars, closet that you may have not used in quite a time, and then really look at the different behaviors of these birds. So it may be intimidating to see all these different shorebirds in a book, and they all kind of look brown and drab to you and all the same. But if you watch the behaviors, that's really going to be your most key way in knowing the differences. Watch the way they feed, the way they walk, and different things that will stand out to you. And then you'll have a more common understanding of what you're looking at. So let's talk about molting and migration. A really cool time of year to watch these birds come in is definitely the end of September, because we get birds that are coming from their breeding plumage. So the red knot you see in that top photo, you see the beautiful red belly. That's when we start seeing them come into our area. We'll see that beautiful color, and then they'll start turning to the drabbish brown and gray. The one on the left in that photo that doesn't have that red belly is most likely a young bird of the year. So he's following along with his parents, but he definitely doesn't have that breeding plumage of yet because he's not the right age. So it's a really cool time to look at the differences in their colorations. Then you can know what birds are younger, and then you can watch them through the following months change and molt. So that bottom left photo is that of a black-bellied plover. So they are jet black. Their whole face and belly is this whole black color. And as you can see, that one's starting to lose its coloration. So it's a great time to see these differences, especially with the younger birds. So the two photos on the right are that of a laughing gull and a royal tern. And we can tell that they're young by looking at the different molting of their plumage. It's a bit harder to see to someone that is not more familiar with it, but you can also tell, with the colorations if these birds are young. So black skimmers, we get big flocks on and clam pass, and we always know when the birds are coming from the New York and New Jersey area, because when they come to our area as a young bird, they actually delay their molt. So the benefit of that is when birds are going through molting, it's definitely going to put them at greater risk to predators, and it's going to affect their flying. The birds have adapted over time, and they adjust when they're going to molt. That way they have the most success in migrating, surviving, and getting everything that they need. So our Florida black skimmers that nest in our area, they start molting right away. They go through their whole molting, and in no time they start looking like the adults. In the following months, as the winter migration goes on, we'll get these birds that come in from New York and New Jersey, and they look like a young bird. So it's really cool to be able to tell these differences, and it's beneficial to these younger birds to wait, because that way they know they're going to survive the migration. And then once they get where they're going to get all that proper food sources and a place to rest, then they'll start the molting. What are some threats during migration? Birds face a lot of threats during migration. One, without thinking of any human and predator involvements whatsoever, would just be the basics of exhaustion and starvation. So these birds are going through a lot. They're traveling miles and miles, and if they miss one food source, or if they get disturbed or disrupted, that they aren't able to get what they need, in some cases they won't survive. Not every juvenile is going to be able to make it the whole distance. So that alone is one of the greatest threats to them. But if you're thinking of all the different influences that we have, and then of course predators and storms, that can also influence them as well. So as I mentioned, storms and natural disasters, hurricanes, different things can put birds off their course. It can delay the amount of time that they're able to get to the locations that they need to. There are a lot of predators not only in the area, but there are birds of prey that are migrating at the same time that these smaller birds are migrating. So things like peregrine falcons and different hawks, they are adapting and involved. This is the time that these smaller birds are going to do these mass migrations, and that way they know they can get food sources as well while they are migrating. That's natural. They're going to pick out the weaker ones, so it helps with it. But in our own area, there's a lot of human involvements that are going to affect these birds. So you may have heard of some cities that turn their lights off during the peak migration times, that we have less disturbance when these birds are traveling at night, because a lot of these birds will use the nighttime for protection. These birds will travel long distances through the night hours, so they avoid any kind of land mammals or any kind of human disturbance, because most things are quiet at that time. But at the same time, making sure that we're putting any kind of stickers or different things on glass windows to avoid any strikes is a really benefit to be able to help them out. Now, monofilament in trash is something that we come across constantly. We're trying to increase awareness of this because the birds are going through enough as is, and then once they get stuck in that line, we've had 2 birds angled to the same line, flying in the opposite directions. They had to swim out in the Gulf. One person went one way and rescue these birds. And that line is so quickly detrimental to these birds. When it wraps around so tightly, it can just immediately snap those bones so quickly. So we're really trying to increase the education to not cut the lines, to make sure you can get that bird and bring it to a rehab center. It may just look like a hook to you that over time will be okay, but those can also cause infection and be a great distress to these species. Now, climate change is also going to impact these birds. Maybe they have loss of habitat in their area, but also a loss of food sources. There's some birds that are losing food sources up north because their waters are warming, so they don't have the proper fish that they need up north. So they're starting to migrate further south to areas that they may not be adjusted to. So they may not want these warmer temperatures, but they're being forced to migrate because they don't have the food that they need to up north. Invasive species are something I'm sure you've heard about in our area, and that's a common occurrence that can cause issues. So you might be thinking of pythons and sometimes iguanas, things like that. That can definitely be of concern. Even other invasive species of birds that are then competing with them for food sources. So all of these can combine, affect their ability to make it. And then looking at human influences of raking, any disturbance, pesticides, toxins, pollutions. That's something that we're really trying to look into of how we can educate everyone to definitely limit any of the issues that we're going to have an affecting on these birds. I'm going to talk about something sad real quick, but this is a huge issue in our area. So red tide is something that we're really trying to find alternative ways to lessen our impacts and how bad it is getting in our locations. So we have been having increasing winters of mass amount of fish die-offs, bird die-offs, marine life. This is affecting parts of the ecosystem. This photo on the left, a lot of these photos are taken by Jean Hall as well as me putting them together. But this photo on the left is just an entire lagoon off of Marco that's just all filled with dead fish. And this is something that we can limit. If you think of the state of Florida, it's a natural sheet flow. So whatever we put on the ground, whether it's in our yards, golf courses, any kind of communities, that's all coming out and going into the Gulf and fueling a lot of our water quality issues. And yes, we're focusing on wildlife, but in turn, this is going to affect us as well. We eat this fish. This is a part of our ecosystem, and it's a lot of part of tourism. It's a part of a lot of people's way of life. Fishing is a big part of a lot of people's, world when they're coming down here. So we're trying to find ways to make sure we can increase education, because when we come across birds, in some cases we can rescue them if we find them quick enough. Red tide birds, if we bring them in to the Conservancy, they do excellent care, taking care of them, trying to immediately get them on any kind of oxygen support, and then flushing them with fluids and getting as much as they can into their system. So if we can get them there quick enough, in some cases they do survive. But then there's the balance of if we rehab them and red tide is still going on, and then we're letting them back out into that environment, it's kind of a hard situation. So we're trying to find ways that we can eliminate any more effect on this ecosystem. So what are some critical habitats that these birds rely on as they migrate to our area? If you've been to Clam Pass in North Naples, you'll notice that that extends to an estuary. So estuaries are basically the soul of all life that exists out in the Gulf. So if you're thinking bait fish that are born there, that's really critical for these birds to eat. But it also provides mudflats. A lot of people look at mudflats and they think it's kind of just a muddy, ucky area that they don't want to walk through. But mudflats are one of the most critical habitats, especially for shorebirds that are looking for things like worms, crustaceans, and anything they can find in the invertebrates in that area. It also provides other species like wading birds, areas that the fish are kind of going into shallow areas. So there's a variety of area for them to feed in that location. But then also tidal pools. Raking is a common occurrence on our beaches. And one thing that does affect these birds is when we rake them too much, they don't have these nice tidal pools that you see in front of these condos. And those tidal pools are critical for bathing, for resting, and also feeding. A lot of species will exist in those locations to be able to survive. And then also oyster bars. You might think of oyster catchers as the main bird that you think of, but there's a lot of different species that feed in oyster bars, whether they be ruddy turnstones, red knots, and a variety of different shorebirds that will come to those locations. So these are all very important habitats that they rely on as they're migrating. If you think of the development that's occurring in our area, a lot of these birds might show up in a location that they've relied on for years and years, and then it's just gone. So they have to adapt and evolve and find other species and locations that they can survive with. So what are they eating in these areas, and all the adaptations that they've had to be able to migrate is kind of mind-blowing. So these birds go through what's called hyperphagia, and I highly recommend reading some articles on it because it's pretty incredible. So essentially these birds will start off with shrinking their internal organs, and a lot of these species are able to do this, which is insane. And this allows them to expand their digestive tracts, and then they can consume more than they ever have in order to survive. So some of these birds will double their entire body weight just to make it to the extensive journeys that they had. And what they're eating is going to be things like carbohydrates and lipids compared to what you might think is protein, because fats are going to be lighter and less heavy for these birds to fly with. So they're going to be fueling up on those fat storages. And as they migrate through the area, then they kind of do the opposite. As they're migrating, then they're able to absorb some of these tissues in order to be a lighter body in order to fly. And they're going to be able to rapidly be able to consume all of those fats that assist them with migrating. So it's pretty incredible, especially with these tinier birds that travel some of the greatest distances, how they're able to adapt. Some of it, we understand the science of it now, but it's still, to think of that they do that every year is one of the most outstanding things. Another thing that they do while they are migrating, for very quick time periods, they're able to basically sleep on the wing. So they're able to shut off half their brain. That way they get these quick minutes of being able to have some rest while they're flying, because a lot of these birds are going hours and hours nonstop. It depends on each individual. A lot of times we get people ask on the beach, well, how long did it take that bird to come here? It all depends. It also depends on what they're coming across, if they need to stop for food or any disturbances that they have. So I wanted to recommend some great areas that you can see in Collier County, that you can look at all these migratory flocks as well as different shorebirds in our area. I've mentioned it a couple times now, but Clam Pass is definitely top on the list, because whether you're on the Pelican Bay side or the Clam Pass side, this is actually the largest flock of black skimmers that is a roosting site in the United States. So we get black skimmers coming down in the hundreds to thousands down to this beach particularly. And we think it is because of not only of the estuary area, but also is because it's kind of a highly populated beach. So when you think of these birds and you see them on the beach in a big flock right next to chairs and all these people, you might wonder why they're sitting there. And one reason would be, so to these birds, we are their protection if we allow them to rest there, because no big predator is going to run up and try to steal a bird in front of us. So the most important thing at these locations is we put up a lot of signs to educate the guests that this is not a normal occurrence in Florida. A lot of people think this is what we see every single day in Florida, is thousands of birds on the beach. This is winter migration. And just like they've traveled down to our area, these birds have done the same. So this beach will get random different times that will get influxes of birds. The photo on the left is actually a day that we had about 2,000 laughing gulls on both sides. I came up thinking it was skimmers, and it was entirely laughing gulls. And they stayed there for about 2 weeks, and then they all left further south. We're assuming they left our area at least. So it's a great location to be able to look. We look for bands on these birds, which I'll talk about in a second. But we also do have stewardship out there on Wednesday and Saturday. So if you ever go out there, you'll see our Lynn Taylor educating everyone about the birds. Another area would be on Marco Island. So whether you're going to Sandtaler or the Tiger Tail Beach area, or even the city beach, you can come across a variety of different species. This presentation really isn't about wading birds, but wading birds are another love of mine that you'll be able to see in the Tiger Tail Lagoon, from roseate spoonbills sometimes wood storks, and then of course all the ibis and egrets that feed in that location. We do also get flocks that love to hang out by the JW Marriott. It's one of their favorite places because once again, the Marriott gets an influx of people. So they use it as protection. And we've been working pretty closely with the Marriott to increase the signage and education in that area. But all from tigertail up to the tip of sand dollar, you can see a variety of different shorebirds and other species that will migrate through our area. Caxambus in the 10,000 Islands is additionally a variety of species and some that you may not see on our beaches. So that's where the oyster catchers and sometimes white pelicans find some security. There's inlets and bays that they get some protection. Yes, you will have to go out by boat in most areas, but some of them are kayak distances as well. So if you go from the Caxambus boat ramp, you can take a kayak around in a calm day. And there's plenty of mud flats out there that you'll see hundreds of different birds that are roosting, feeding, and resting. But then they're also keeping an eye out for different predators that also exist in there. So we a lot of times see bald eagles and different hawks that will go out there to feed because they know these big flats are hanging out there. And this isn't really mainly a shorebird area, but if you've ever been to Marsh Trail, that's definitely another location to go, especially in the early morning and night, because this is where we get a high density roosting of wading birds. So you can watch them either take off in the morning or come in at nighttime, but there's hundreds of birds. It's along 41, pretty far south, but it's a great location. And you still might spot some shorebirds that are using random different areas of mudflats and mangroves to feed. So stewardship is a big part of Audubon Western Everglades, and one of the most critical things that we do is educating on the beach all about the different species that people are seeing. And most people aren't aware, as I mentioned, what these different birds are, where they came from. So it's a really important job. We bring out scopes and binoculars. That way kids and adults both can look through these and see these birds up close, compared to causing harassment by bringing phones or anything like that. And of course, signage. We've increased our pamphlets at different marinas and also beach locations. That way people can understand what these flocks are and spend some time learning more about them. This is what we're trying to avoid. So disturbance comes in many forms. We get it through boats, we get it through running through them, sending their kids through them while filming them, and of course, dogs that are off leash. So this is what we're trying to increase education towards, and we've made a big difference in our area. Even at Clem Pass, we see the amount of people that look at our sign. The beach basically erodes down. You can see all the footprints. So people are aware. And they're starting to educate also within each other. So we have citizens that are going up to other citizens, letting them know, hey, you shouldn't run through those birds. You know, they've migrated really far, and they, they go through a lot of stress in order to find these serenity places to relax. So banded birds are one of the best parts of our stewardship and also our surveys. It's kind of like a scavenger hunt. And once you get people that are interested in it, then they end up coming out every day with us, because it's incredible that we can look at these species and know how old they are, where they've migrated from. And we give this data all to the biologists that have banded them. It goes through a whole banding system, and they then know that the individual birds that they banded ended up surviving to their locations, where they're migrating to. And there's a great database that's just all over the board of people that are discovering that these birds are now migrating down to Mexico. There's so much information that we're learning. So that black skimmer chart that you see in the center, we have seen black skimmers banded from the orange, yellow, blue, white, black, all the way down the coast. But this was actually our first season that we spotted a red banded black skimmer. It wasn't from Texas, it was actually from Mississippi, because they use the same band color. But it was exciting because now that they're starting to band the birds there, now we can see that some of those species aren't just going down south to the Mexico area, they're also coming over to Florida, which is, a bit of a different travel over the water, or maybe they are using the mainland to travel and they're furthering south. So it's really incredible to see these birds. We've had one piping plover that has come to our beach for about 12 years now. So it's fun for the kids to be able to ID them as well. So how you can help if you're interested in volunteering, definitely reach out to me or check out our website. You can come out on the beach with myself or our steward and definitely educate any of the public that's in that area. But of course, as always, consider your own impact on these birds, whether it's making sure you're picking up trash from the beach, putting things in your windows to limit any kind of disturbance for these species, as well as turning off your lights off at night. But if anyone has any questions, feel free. Otherwise, you can use my contact below at any time. I appreciate everyone for watching.